I've always found comfort in the silence of the woods. Out here, away from people, away from the world, you can think straight. George Washington and Jefferson National Forest had been my sanctuary for years, my escape from the clutter of civilization. But this time, something felt different. Office. Like the land itself was holding a secret it didn't want to share. It had been a rough few months. Lisa left me and I couldn't say I didn't see it coming. I'd been distant, losing myself in work, then losing the work altogether. I thought a few days alone, hunting and camping, would clear my head. I needed space, and the mountains were the only place I knew where I could truly breathe. The plan was simple. 3 days, 4 tops. Head out to the edge of Silent Pines, the area where the deer roam freely and the mountains are still untouched by the tourist crowd. I'd bag a buck, maybe 2, and return with meat for the freezer. Just me, my gear, and the quiet hum of nature. But it didn't take long for that comfort and hum to go disturbingly quiet. The first day was uneventful, at least at first. I parked my truck at the trailhead, loaded up my pack, slung my rifle over my shoulder, and began the familiar hike up into the heart of the forest. My boots crunched over the leaf-covered trail as I climbed higher, the dense trees closing in around me. The fresh mountain air was cool, the perfect kind of crisp that made you feel alive, but something was off. I noticed it halfway through the hike. The usual sounds of the forest, the birds, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush were missing. There was only the sound of my own footsteps and the occasional creak of the trees swaying gently in the wind. I shook it off as nerves. It was always a little eerie out here in the deep woods, especially when you were alone. That was part of the appeal. I told myself it was just the tension I'd been feeling lately, everything weighing on my chest, turning normal things into problems. I set up camp in the clearing near the stream I remembered from previous trips. The sun was starting to dip behind the mountain ridge, casting long shadows over the landscape. The fire crackled warmly as I cooked up some canned stew, sipping from a tin cup of lukewarm coffee, trying to push away the gnawing feeling that something wasn't quite right. It wasn't until later that night, after the fire had burned low and I was stretched out in my sleeping bag, that I noticed the first real sign. Footsteps. At first, I thought it was just an animal. I mean, what else could it be? Deer, maybe a raccoon, but it didn't sound like that. It sounded like someone walking. A soft, deliberate crunch in the leaves moving slowly, as if it was circling the camp. I lay still, holding my breath, listening intently. The steps grew closer, then stopped. I sat up slowly, reaching for the flashlight and rifle by my side. The firelight flickered dimly, casting long, jittery shadows around the clearing, but there was nothing there. I scanned the tree line, heart pounding harder than I'd like to admit. Nothing moved. Just trees, standing tall and silent, watching. Must have been the wind, I muttered, my voice shaky. I lay back down, my grip tight on the rifle. I'd always prided myself on being a tough, no-nonsense kind of guy, but something about those footsteps didn't sit right with me. It wasn't the sound itself. It was the feeling that came with it, like I was being watched. The next morning, things got worse. My water jug was gone. I thought I'd been careful about where I left it, but maybe I hadn't sealed it tight. Maybe an animal dragged it off during the night. I searched the area, looking for signs of raccoons or coyotes, but all I found were footprints. Human, barefoot, and small, like a child's. But what child would be wandering around the woods, miles away from the nearest road, in the dead of night? I crouched down, running my fingers over the soft dirt where the prints had pressed into the earth. They seemed fresh, leading in a slow, meandering pattern around the campsite before disappearing into the woods. My skin crawled. A chill ran down my spine as I stared at the tracks, my mind racing through every possible explanation. None of them made sense. By midday, I had convinced myself that it must have been some local kids playing a prank. Maybe I'd stumbled into someone's turf without realizing it. But as I hiked deeper into the woods, rifle ready, the sense of unease only grew stronger. Every step I took felt heavy, like the trees themselves were watching me, closing in tighter. And then I saw it. I was tracking a deer along the ridgeline when I noticed movement in the trees just ahead. At first, I thought it was the buck I'd been hunting, but then it stepped out into the clearing. A figure, tall, hunched, and gaunt. Its body was draped in shadow, but I could see the faint outline of its pale, too long limbs, like a man twisted in ways a man shouldn't be. And those eyes. Two glowing yellow eyes staring right at me. I froze, rifle raised, heart hammering in my chest. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the wind dead and still around us. The figure didn't move, didn't blink. It just stood there, watching me. "Who the hell are you?" I called out, my voice cracking in the silence. No answer. I swallowed hard, taking a step back. The figure disappeared into the trees as silently as it had appeared. My hands were shaking, the rifle's barrel wobbling as I lowered it, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I tried to tell myself it was just a shadow, a trick of the light, but I knew better. I'd seen it, and whatever it wasn't human. That night, the footsteps returned. Louder this time, circling the camp with purpose. I stayed awake, rifle in hand, listening to the crunch of leaves as it moved closer. Every time I thought I'd hear it right outside my tent, the steps would stop, leaving only the suffocating silence. I couldn't sleep, couldn't even close my eyes without imagining those yellow eyes watching me from the darkness. By the third day, I was a mess. Exhausted, jumpy, paranoid. I hadn't seen the figure again, but I could feel it. Following me, watching. The forest, once my refuge, had become a prison. I couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how fast I walked, no matter how deep I went, it was always just behind me, waiting. That afternoon, I found more footprints. This time, they were right outside my tent, circling it in strange, looping patterns. There were dozens of them, overlapping, almost chaotic, as if someone, or something, had danced around the camp all night. My heart raced as I traced the tracks, panic creeping into my bones. The final straw came that evening. I was sitting by the fire, trying to calm my nerves when I heard it again. The soft, whispering voice carried on the wind. It was faint, almost indistinguishable from the rustle of the trees, but I could make out one thing clearly. It was my name, Nate. I shot to my feet, spinning around, scanning the darkened woods for any sign of movement. The voice called again, softer this time, but closer. Nate. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my gear, stuffing it into my pack as fast as I could, heart pounding in my ears. I needed to leave. Now, whatever was out there, whatever had been stalking me for days, wasn't just a trick of the mind. It was real, and it wasn't going to let me go easily. As I slung my pack over my shoulder and reached for my rifle, I felt it. A presence behind me. I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat. There, standing at the edge of the firelight, was the figure. Tall, twisted, with limbs too long and eyes glowing a sickly yellow. Its face was pale and gaunt, hollow eyes staring into me as if it could see straight through my skin and into my soul. I raised the rifle, but before I could pull the trigger, it vanished. Just gone. Like smoke dissolving into the night air, I ran. I didn't care about the trail, didn't care about my gear. I ran as fast as I could through the forest, branches slapping at my face, rocks and roots tripping me up as I sprinted blindly through the trees. I could hear it behind me, the soft crunch of footsteps following, never far behind. By the time I reached the trailhead, my lungs were burning. My legs felt like jelly, and my mind was racing with fear. I threw myself into the truck, slamming the door shut, the silence inside the cab deafening. My hands shook as I fumbled for the keys, finally starting the engine and peeling out of there as fast as I could. Even now, weeks later, I can't get it out of my head. The figure, those eyes, the voice that called my name, luring me deeper into the woods. I haven't told anyone about it. No one would believe me anyway. Just another man who got lost in the forest, right? But I know what I saw. I know what was out there. I haven't been back to the mountains since, and every time I close my eyes, I still see it. Watching, waiting. I thought I knew isolation. I'd spent years driving across the country, chasing celestial events, camping in places no one else dared to go. Black Rock Desert was supposed to be no different. I'd chosen this spot because it was one of the darkest places in the United States, far from the light pollution of cities, with nothing but the stars above and the cracked earth below. A perfect place to watch the meteor shower I'd been anticipating for months. But the desert has a way of getting under your skin. I arrived in the late afternoon, the sun blazing high, its rays bouncing off the endless white of the salt flats. The ground stretched out in every direction, flat and featureless, interrupted only by distant mountains rising like ghosts on the horizon. It was beautiful in a desolate way, the kind of place that makes you feel small and insignificant. Exactly what I needed. The RV's engine rumbled to a stop, kicking up dust as I parked. I opened the door, stepping into the dry, hot air. The silence was immediate. No wind, no rustling leaves, no distant hum of civilization, just a profound, almost oppressive stillness. I told myself it was peaceful, that this was what I wanted. A few days alone in the desert to focus on my photography and watch the night sky. But as I looked out over the vast expanse of cracked earth, a strange feeling settled in my chest, like a weight pressing down. I brushed it off. It had been a long drive and the heat was getting to me. I'd feel better once the sun went down. I spent the first few hours setting up camp, adjusting my telescope and testing my camera equipment. The sky was still a blazing blue, but the desert's unforgiving heat was beginning to fade, replaced by a sharp chill as the sun sank lower. By the time dusk arrived, the temperature had plummeted, and I retreated into the RV, grabbing a jacket before stepping back outside. That's when the radio first crackled to life. I'd brought my old ham radio along, hoping to catch some weather updates or maybe listen in on local astronomy broadcasts. I hadn't expected much out here, but the static-filled hum surprised me. I turned the dial, searching for a signal, and for a moment I thought I'd found one. A faint voice cutting through the static. "Don't stay." I froze. The words were barely audible, like a whisper carried on the wind, but they were unmistakable. I leaned closer, adjusting the frequency, but the voice was gone, replaced by the familiar hiss of static. I turned the radio off, chalking it up to interference. Old equipment, weird atmosphere, it was nothing. But the unease in my chest was growing. The first night was incredible. The sky came alive with meteors streaking across the blackness, more stars than I'd ever seen in my life. I stood in awe, snapping pictures, adjusting my telescope, completely losing track of time. Out here, under the stars, the rest of the world felt far away. It was just me, the night, and the vastness of space, and yet something nagged at me. When I reviewed the photos later, I noticed something strange. In the background of one of my long exposure shots, there was a blur, a faint, almost imperceptible smudge. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Dust on the lens, maybe, or a glitch in the camera's settings. But as I scrolled through the rest of the images, the blur appeared again and again. In each photo, the blur seemed closer to the RV. I wiped the camera lens, took another shot, and stared hard at the screen. Nothing. It had to be some kind of artifact from the desert air, the heat mixing with the cold night, playing tricks on the lens. Still, the feeling in my chest tightened. I turned in early, trying to push the unease aside, telling myself I'd check the equipment in the morning. Day 2 was different. I woke to a stifling heat that even the RV's air conditioning couldn't seem to fight. I cursed, fiddling with the controls, but the air blowing through the vents was weak, warm. I grabbed a bottle of water and stepped outside, hoping the breeze would provide some relief, but the air was dead, still as the grave. I spent most of the day trying to fix the RV's engine, which had been acting sluggish since I arrived. I knew I should be enjoying the desert, but the more time I spent out there, the more the silence started to gnaw at me. It wasn't the peaceful isolation I'd expected. It felt watchful. As the day dragged on, the sun beat down, turning the ground beneath my feet into a furnace. The radio, which had been quiet since last night's strange transmission, crackled to life again. This time, the voice was clearer. "Danger. You need to leave." I dropped the wrench I was holding, staring at the radio in disbelief. The voice was faint, distorted, like it was coming from miles away, but it was unmistakable. Someone, or something, was speaking to me. I snatched up the radio, twisting the dial, trying to find the source. Static. Nothing but static. The voice was gone again, leaving me standing in the middle of the desert, sweat running down my back, my heart hammering in my chest. I should have left then. I should have packed up and driven out of there, but the RV's engine was still stalling, and part of me didn't want to admit that I was spooked. This was why I came out here, wasn't it? To face my fears, to be alone in the dark. I stayed. And that night, the shadows came. The meteor shower was more intense on the second night, the sky alive with fire and light. I sat by the RV, staring up at the heavens, the vastness of the universe overwhelming. But no matter how beautiful the stars were, my eyes kept drifting back to the edges of the desert, where the darkness seemed to pool, thick and impenetrable. It was there, at the far edge of my vision, that I first saw the figure. A shape, standing just beyond the reach of my campfire's light. At first, I thought it was a trick of the eye. The desert plays with your perception. Distances blur, shadows stretch, but when I blinked, the figure was still there, standing, watching. I grabbed my camera, adjusting the focus, snapping a shot before the figure disappeared. I wasn't sure what I was expecting. Maybe an animal, or even another camper who'd wandered too close. But when I checked the camera's screen, my blood went cold. The figure wasn't human. It was tall, too tall, with elongated limbs and a strange distorted form. It was like a shadow brought to life, a smear of darkness against the starlit sky. The more I stared at it, the more unreal it looked. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I slowly lowered the camera. When I looked again, the figure was gone. The air was suddenly freezing, the kind of cold that bites at your skin. I retreated into the RV, locking the door behind me, my heart racing. I told myself I was imagining things. The desert played tricks on people. I'd read about it, people seeing things that weren't there, hearing voices carried on the wind, but that didn't explain the figure in the photo. The night dragged on, and I stayed awake, listening for anything, any sound, any movement. but all I heard was the persistent hum of the radio and the static growing louder by the minute. The next day, I knew I had to leave. Whatever was out here, it wasn't just my imagination. The figure, the voices, I couldn't explain it, and I didn't want to. I packed up as quickly as I could, but when I turned the key in the ignition, the RV sputtered and died. I tried again, and again, nothing. I stepped out into the desert, sweat pouring down my face, the heat oppressive. The silence pressed in on me, suffocating. I tried to call for help, but my phone had no signal, and the radio was useless. Just a constant, garbled stream of static. Then the voice returned, louder than ever. "Stay. Come closer." It wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a command. And when I looked out across the desert, I saw the figure again, closer this time, standing in the distance, its form hazy and indistinct, but unmistakable. It was waiting for me. My legs felt like lead as I backed toward the RV, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The air was freezing now, the warmth of the day gone, replaced by a bone-deep chill. I knew in that moment that if I stayed, I would become like the figure, a shadow, a ghost, trapped in this forsaken place, wandering the desert forever. I ran. I don't know how I got the RV started. Maybe it was adrenaline, or maybe sheer panic. But when the engine finally roared to life, I slammed the gas pedal to the floor and didn't look back. The figure, the voice, the cold, they all faded into the distance as I sped across the salt flats, the desert stretching endlessly behind me. I never looked at the photos again. I couldn't. Whatever was out there, it was better left unseen. I'll never return to Black Rock Desert. Some places were meant to be empty. When you spend enough time alone, the silence becomes something else. It's no longer a backdrop, but a living, breathing thing that creeps in around the edges of your thoughts. I thought I liked the silence. That's why I'd been living on the road for months, with no one but myself and my RV for company. But this trip to Ocala National Forest, it was supposed to be different. I needed to reset, to get my head straight. I guess that's what they all say before they lose it. The first day was easy enough. I set up camp on the edge of the forest, not far from one of the swamps that ran through Ocala. I'd picked this spot on purpose, far enough from the touristy campgrounds, but close enough to the water that I could take some good photos. Photography had become my new hobby, something to fill the long stretches of time, something to keep my mind off Rachel. The forest was thick with towering pines and oaks, their branches twisting and closing in overhead. The light filtered through the leaves in a way that made the air seem heavy, almost suffocating. But it was peaceful. Or at least, I told myself it was. I parked the RV near a clearing, right where the swamp met the woods. The ground was firm enough, and I didn't think much of the water nearby. I had no reason to worry. Not yet. By the time I finished setting up, the sun was already dipping low, casting long shadows that stretched across the clearing. The air was still, unnervingly still, like the whole forest was holding its breath. But I didn't mind. Solitude was the whole point. I sat outside for a while, watching the last of the light fade, before retreating inside the RV. The hum of the small generator I'd hooked up was the only sound breaking the silence. Everything seemed fine. Everything was fine, until the lights started flickering. It was subtle at first, just a dimming of the overhead lights. I figured the wiring was faulty, nothing I couldn't fix. I'm a mechanic by trade, after all. I ignored it, settling in with a book, trying to lose myself in the words. But then the flickering got worse. The lights flashed on and off in rapid succession, the shadows in the RV dancing wildly before everything went dark. I sighed, more frustrated than anything, and grabbed my flashlight. After a few minutes of fumbling with the wires, I got the power back on. The lights stabilized, but there was something else. A soft buzzing noise. Faint, just at the edge of hearing, like a distant hum. It might have been the swamp, maybe bugs, or just the generator straining, but it set me on edge. That night, I barely slept. The next morning, the unease I'd felt the night before was gone, replaced by a sense of calm. The sunlight was warm, the swamp shimmering in the early light. I grabbed my camera and set out for a walk, looking for something worth capturing. Ocala's known for its beauty, the kind of untouched wilderness that's hard to find these days. But the deeper I walked into the woods, the more I realized something was off. It started small, little things I could have easily ignored. My compass acting up, the needle spinning lazily before settling in the wrong direction. The buzzing sound from the night before returned, louder now, seeming to come from all around me. I chalked it up to the swamp, mosquitoes maybe, or some malfunction with the generator still ringing in my ears. But when I came back to camp, I noticed the first real sign that something wasn't right. My gear, things I'd left on the picnic table outside, was scattered across the ground, not in a way that suggested wind either. The table had been cleared. My flashlight, the lantern, the tools I'd left out, all of them were scattered in a perfect line toward the swamp. I stopped, staring at the items. Someone had been here. Or something. I'm not easily spooked, but my gut told me to get back inside. Lock the doors. That night, I sat in the RV, every light on, clutching a lantern just in case the power flickered again. I told myself it was fine. Probably some animal. Bears get curious, right? But when the tapping started, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was soft at first. Just a light tapping on the window like something was brushing against it. I glanced over but didn't see anything. I convinced myself it was the wind, the branches moving in the breeze. But then the tapping came again, and again. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door, stepping out into the cold night air. The swamp smelled foul, like rot and decay, and the buzzing sound was back, louder than ever. I swept the beam of the flashlight across the clearing, and that's when I saw them. Footprints, large, human-like prints, leading right up to the window of my RV. The mud was fresh, still wet from the swamp, and the prints were clear. But there were no other signs of anyone around, no trails leading away. Just those prints, stopping right at the window, then nothing. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I wanted to believe it was someone playing a prank, some camper messing with me. But I hadn't seen another soul since I got here. No cars at the trailhead, no signs of other campers nearby. I hurried back inside, locking the door, but I knew it wouldn't help. The feeling in my gut told me I was being watched. By the third day, I wanted out. I'd seen enough. But when I tried to start the RV, nothing happened. The engine clicked, but it wouldn't turn over. I tried again and again, but the RV refused to start. Panic settled in. My phone had no signal this deep in the forest, and the nearest ranger station was miles away. The buzzing sound was louder now, constant, like a low hum in the back of my skull. I packed a bag and decided to hike out. Staying another night was out of the question. The trail was familiar enough, but something was different. The air was thick, stifling, and the swamp seemed to have crept closer. I hadn't noticed it before, but the water was rising, soaking the ground around my campsite. The once dry trail was now a muddy mess, slowing me down as I tried to navigate through the trees. And then I saw them. At first, they were just shadows, moving between the trees, barely visible in the corner of my eye. I stopped, trying to focus, but every time I turned to look, they were gone. My heart raced. I pushed forward, faster now, but the shadows followed me. They stayed just out of sight, flickering in and out of existence like ghosts. By the time I reached the halfway point, the whispers started. It wasn't loud, just a faint, distant murmur, but it was unmistakable. Voices speaking in a language I didn't understand, too quiet to make out the words. I spun around, searching for the source, but there was nothing. Just the trees, the swamp, and those damn shadows. The trail blurred before my eyes and I stumbled, my head swimming. I couldn't think straight. The buzzing, the whispers, it was too much. I needed to get out of here. But no matter which way I turned, the trail led me back to the swamp. It was like the forest was folding in on itself, trapping me in a maze of water and trees. My head throbbed, my vision blurred, and then I saw them. Standing at the edge of the swamp, barely visible in the twilight, were the figures. They were tall, too tall to be human, with elongated limbs and dark, featureless faces. They didn't move. They just stood there, watching me, their forms flickering in and out of the shadows like something half-formed, not fully real. I backed away, my heart pounding, but they didn't follow. They didn't need to. The buzzing sound grew louder, the whispers more insistent. I turned and ran, not caring where the trail led. I just needed to get away. When I finally collapsed back at the RV, drenched in sweat and mud, the sun was already setting. The swamp had crept even closer, the water now lapping at the edges of the clearing. I locked myself inside, every light on, but it didn't matter. I could still hear them. The whispers, the tapping, the buzzing, it all grew louder, closing in on me from every side. I knew what was out there. I'd seen it, and it was only a matter of time before it got in. I sat there in the dark, clutching the flashlight, waiting for the moment when the door would creak open, waiting for the shadows to finally step into the light. I don't know how long I sat there. Hours? Days? The buzzing is in my head now, a constant hum I can't escape. The figures, they're closer. I can see them outside, just beyond the trees, their eyes glowing in the darkness. They're waiting for me, and I'm not sure how much longer I can resist. I thought a week alone in the Apache Sitgreaves National Forest would be the perfect way to clear my head. After everything that had happened, the divorce, leaving the military, and that nagging feeling I'd wasted years of my life, I figured some isolation would help me reset. So I packed up my RV, grabbed my gear, and drove deep into the heart of the forest. I should have known better. When I first pulled into the campsite, I felt that familiar sense of calm I used to get on deployment, a kind of satisfaction that comes with being prepared for whatever the wilderness might throw at me. The Apache Sitgreaves is a vast, rugged place, and this far in, you don't see many other campers. That's why I picked it. No people, no distractions, just the forest, my RV, and my thoughts. I set up camp quickly, parking the RV at the edge of a tree line overlooking a deep ravine. The view was incredible. The trees spread out like a sea of green, with the sun dipping low, casting long shadows over the land. I spent the first day hiking, snapping a few photos of the landscape and trying to relax. By nightfall, the temperature dropped sharply, but I welcomed the cold. It felt like the world was trying to numb me, erase the pain I'd been carrying since Rachel left. I lit a small fire, sat by it, and let the quiet settle in. That's what I wanted, after all. But the silence felt different out here. It wasn't peaceful. It was watchful. The first night passed uneventfully, but something woke me around 3 a.m. I sat bolt upright, listening. There it was again. a sound just outside the RV. It wasn't the usual rustle of wildlife or the distant call of an owl. No, this was different. Slow, deliberate footsteps. At first, I thought maybe another camper had wandered into my area, but when I peered through the window, all I saw was blackness, the dense trees illuminated only by the faint moonlight. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The cold air hit me immediately, sharp and biting. I swept the beam of light across the campsite, scanning the edges of the trees. Footsteps had stopped. Nothing moved. The fire had long since died out, leaving behind only a few glowing embers. No signs of anyone. I convinced myself it was probably just an animal and went back inside, locking the door behind me. But even as I lay back down, the hairs on the back of my neck stayed up, like I wasn't alone. By the second day, I was already starting to feel the isolation. The weather was turning colder than I'd expected. And to make matters worse, the RV's heater was acting up. It kept cutting out, leaving the inside freezing at night. I spent hours trying to figure out what was wrong, but it was no use. I'd have to tough it out. I hiked out again that afternoon, looking for some distraction. The forest was beautiful, but in an unforgiving way. The trails were rough, and after a while I veered off the main path, looking for more secluded spots to explore. I told myself it was for the photography, but really, I just wanted to be somewhere no one could find me. That's when I first saw the carvings. At first, I didn't even notice them. They were subtle, old, just faint marks on the trees. I stopped to take a break and caught sight of one right in front of me. A series of lines etched into the bark, almost like a symbol. I ran my fingers over it, feeling the grooves. It wasn't natural. Someone, or something, had put it there. As I moved on, I found more of them, scattered in no particular pattern, but close enough to make me uneasy. They circled the area where I'd set up camp, like some kind of boundary. I shook off the strange feeling gnawing at my gut. This forest was old. People had been here long before me, carving symbols and marks for reasons long forgotten. Nothing to worry about, but I didn't stop worrying. That night, I woke up again, the same time as before, 3 a.m. The footsteps were back, closer this time. The sound was unmistakable, soft but deliberate, like someone walking slowly around the RV, testing the ground with each step. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps circled the RV, paused, then resumed. My heart pounded in my chest. I reached for the flashlight but hesitated. What if it wasn't a person? What if it was something else? The footsteps stopped. Dead silence. Then I heard the tapping. Soft, rhythmic taps on the windows. My mouth went dry. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The taps grew louder, more insistent, coming from all sides of the RV now. I forced myself to get up, slowly, and crept to the nearest window. My hands shook as I pulled the curtain back just a little. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness outside. Nothing. Just the forest and the shadows. But when I looked again, I saw it. A handprint, pressed against the glass, smudged and distorted, like someone or something had leaned in close. The print was too large to be human. Its fingers were long, unnaturally so, and the palm had an odd, warped shape to it. I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight, my heart hammering in my chest. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, but the tapping eventually stopped. The air felt thick, like it was pushing down on me, suffocating me. I stayed awake the rest of the night, gripping my hunting knife, waiting for the footsteps to return. By the third day, I was ready to leave. I packed my gear and decided to head out early. Whatever had been out there the night before, I didn't want to find out. But when I tried to start the RV, the engine wouldn't turn over. I tried again and again, but nothing. Dead. The frustration boiled over into panic. I was stranded. I grabbed my map and decided I'd have to hike out to the nearest ranger station a few miles away. It wasn't ideal, but I couldn't stay here another night. Not with whatever was out there. I set off down the trail, moving fast. The cold had seeped into my bones, but I pushed on, hoping to make it before dark. The forest felt different now. Darker, heavier. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow hiding something just out of sight. And the feeling of being watched, it never went away. About halfway to the station, I heard it again. Footsteps. They weren't my own. I stopped, listening, my hand resting on the knife at my side. Then I heard a voice. It came from behind me, soft and distant. "Liam." I froze. My blood ran cold. "Liam, help me." The voice was familiar. Too familiar. It was Rachel's voice, my ex-wife. But she wasn't here. She couldn't be here. I turned slowly, scanning the trees. Nothing. "Liam." Her voice again, closer this time. I felt a wave of nausea roll over me. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. My mind was playing tricks on me. I started walking again, faster this time, my eyes darting around, looking for any sign of movement. The voice followed me, calling my name over and over. I clenched my fists, trying to block it out, trying to focus on the trail. But then I saw it. Standing in the middle of the path, not 20 feet ahead. The figure was tall, too tall to be human. Its limbs were long and thin, draped in tattered rags that seemed to shift in the wind. Its face, there was no face, just a void, a swirling mass of darkness where its features should have been. Its eyes, though, its eyes were glowing, bright yellow like two embers burning in the night. I stumbled back, my heart racing. The thing didn't move. It just stood there, watching me, waiting. I fumbled for my knife, holding it out in front of me, though I knew it wouldn't do any good. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but there was no sense to it. This thing wasn't human. It wasn't natural. The Watcher, something from old Apache legends, stories I'd heard long ago, was real, and it had found me. The thing took a step forward and I turned and ran. I didn't care where I was going anymore. I just needed to get away. I don't remember much of the run. It was a blur of trees and shadows, the forest closing in on me as I tore through the underbrush, branches clawing at my clothes, the Watcher's eyes burning into my back. Somehow, I made it to the ranger station. I don't know how, but when I stumbled into the clearing and saw the small building, I nearly collapsed in relief. I burst through the door, breathless and shaking. The ranger inside looked up, startled, but I couldn't form the words to explain what had happened. I didn't need to. When I finally caught my breath, I told him everything. The footsteps, the handprints, the thing in the forest. He didn't believe me, of course. Why would he? He checked my RV later, saw the scratches and the smudged handprint, but still shrugged it off. "Probably just a bear," he said, "but I know better. As I sit here now, writing this down, I can still feel it. The Watcher's eyes on me. It's waiting, watching, and it'll follow me no matter where I go. Some things you can't outrun." I came to Red River Gorge to find peace, or at least that's what I told myself. When you've lost everything, when your life's fallen apart, nature feels like the only refuge. The solitude, the silence, they're supposed to help you clear your mind, right? But if I'd known what waited for me in those woods, I might have stayed home. I parked my old Jeep at the trailhead, strapped on my pack, and set off. The first day was perfect. The crisp autumn air had the faint smell of wet leaves, and the colors, God, the colors were dazzling. I'm a photographer by trade now, trying to make a name for myself since leaving teaching. The leaves, in their fiery oranges and deep reds, made the perfect backdrop for my shots. It was the kind of beauty you could get lost in. I guess that's what I was hoping for. The trail was tough, though, harder than I expected. The steep climbs had my legs burning, and my pack felt heavier with every step. I could feel the camera bouncing against my back, reminding me why I was here. The plan was simple. A week alone in the wilderness, just me, my gear, and enough food to get by. No distractions, no people, no Rachel. I shook the thought out of my head and kept walking, focusing on the landscape instead. The river was nearby, its faint gurgle a calming soundtrack to the crunch of leaves underfoot. But by the time the sun started to dip, I was more exhausted than I should have been. My muscles ached from the unfamiliar terrain, and blisters had already formed on my heels. I set up camp by the river. I'd brought an old tent that had seen better days, but I figured it would hold up fine for a week. The stove, a clearance sale special, was already giving me trouble. The flame flickered weakly, as if unsure of itself, and I ended up eating half-cooked noodles before giving up and settling into my sleeping bag. That first night, I didn't sleep well. At first, it was just the usual, branches rustling, the wind whispering through the leaves. But around midnight, I heard something strange. It sounded like a voice, faint but unmistakable, drifting through the trees. I sat up, listening. It came again, too soft to make out words, but there was a rhythm to it, a cadence like speech. My heart began to pound. I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe distant campers, but there had been no cars at the trailhead. I was alone out here. Still, I convinced myself that it was nothing and eventually drifted back to sleep. The next day was harder. The trail was steep, and my legs were sore from the day before. The scenery was still breathtaking, but the deeper I went into the gorge, the more oppressive it felt. The trees grew closer together, their branches blocking out the sun, casting long shadows that made the woods seem darker than they should have been. It was around midday when I first saw it. I was setting up a shot of a rocky outcrop, the kind of thing that might make a good feature for my portfolio, when I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise. It was that primal sensation, the one that tells you you're not alone. It turned slowly, scanning the trees, and there it was, just within the tree line, maybe 30 feet away. At first, I thought it was a person, someone tall and thin, wearing a long, tattered coat. But something was off. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching me. I blinked, and it was gone. I laughed nervously, trying to shake off the unease. "You're just seeing things," I muttered to myself. "It's nothing." But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, the whispers returned. They were louder this time, clearer. I could almost make out words, but they were garbled, like someone trying to speak underwater. I lay in my tent, wide-eyed and tense, listening. The sound wasn't coming from one direction. It seemed to swirl around the camp, circling me. I grabbed my flashlight and zipped open the tent, shining the beam into the woods. There was nothing. Just the trees, the river, the empty night. But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, closer. I wanted to call out, but my throat was dry, my mouth frozen. I was too scared to make a sound, as if acknowledging it would make it real. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I unzipped the tent fully and stepped outside, the cold air hitting me like a slap. My breath came in sharp, visible puffs as I scanned the darkness. Then I saw the footprints. They were large, human-shaped, and fresh, pressed into the damp earth around my tent. They hadn't been there before I went to bed. My heart raced as I knelt down to examine them. They circled my campsite, as though someone, or something, had been watching me, walking around while I slept. Panic bubbled up in my chest. I backed away slowly, stumbling as I scrambled back into the tent and zipped it up as fast as I could. I huddled in my sleeping bag, clutching my flashlight like a lifeline. The whispers continued, relentless, until dawn. By the third day, I was a wreck. I hadn't slept, and every step felt like agony. My legs were leaden, my pack seemed twice as heavy, and my mind was unraveling. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent my heart into overdrive. I wanted to leave, but I was too far in now. It would take me days to hike back out, and the thought of turning around filled me with a strange sense of dread. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like the gorge itself didn't want me to leave, like it was holding me here, drawing me deeper into its clutches. I kept walking, pushing through the exhaustion, trying to ignore the whispers that still echoed in my head. By midday, I found myself near the river again at a small clearing. I decided to stop and rest, hoping the sight of the water might calm me. But as I sat there, staring at the rippling current, I saw something across the river bank. The figure. It was standing on the opposite shore, half hidden by the trees. I could see it more clearly now, tall and impossibly thin, its limbs too long for its body. It wore tattered, grayish rags that fluttered in the breeze, but its face was a blur, a smudge of darkness that seemed to shift and warp as I stared at it. My pulse quickened and my breath caught in my throat. I fumbled for my camera, desperate to capture proof that I wasn't losing my mind. I raised the lens, focused on the figure, and snapped the shutter. The moment I did, the figure flickered, like static on an old TV. 1 second it was there, and the next it wasn't. Gone. I lowered the camera, my hands trembling. My gut told me to leave, to get the hell out of here, but my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, frozen by fear. The whispers returned, louder now, almost angry. They filled the air around me, a cacophony of voices speaking over each other, too fast to understand. And then I felt it, a cold, sharp pressure on my shoulder, like fingers pressing into my skin. I screamed, scrambling to my feet and backing away from the riverbank. The coldness followed me, clinging to me like invisible hands trying to pull me down. I ran, blindly, recklessly, away from the water, away from the voices. I didn't stop until I collapsed against a tree, gasping for breath. The whispers had faded, but the cold lingered, sinking deep into my bones. I was shaking, my mind reeling, trying to make sense of what I'd just experienced. That night, I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I sat by my dying campfire, clutching my camera, my eyes darting nervously around the darkened woods. The whispers had returned, but they were softer now, distant. I knew I wasn't alone. The figure, the wraith, as I'd come to call it, was out there, watching me, waiting for me. I tried to rationalize it, but there was no denying the truth anymore. This wasn't just my imagination. This wasn't a trick of the light or the wind playing games with my mind. There was something in these woods, something ancient, something angry. On the 5th day, I decided to leave. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, my hands shaking with nervous energy. I didn't care how long it took. I had to get out of this place, but the gorge had other plans. As I made my way back toward the trailhead, the path seemed to shift beneath my feet. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't find the way out. Every turn brought me back to the same spot, the same trees, the same stretch of river. It was like the forest was folding in on itself, trapping me in a maze of endless woods. And then I saw it again, the wraith. It stood in the distance, half hidden by the shadows, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. I raised my camera again, my only weapon, and snapped the shutter. The wraith flickered, its form distorting, but it didn't disappear. It moved toward me, slow and deliberate, its tattered clothes trailing behind it like smoke. The whispers grew louder, the air around me colder, thicker. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stumbled backward, my heart racing in my chest. The wraith didn't stop. It came closer and closer until it stood just feet away from me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Its face, a swirling mass of darkness, hovered inches from mine. And then, in a voice that was both a whisper and a scream, it spoke. "You can't leave." When I woke up, I was lying on the riverbank, soaked to the bone. The wraith was gone, but the memory of its voice lingered in my mind, an echo that refused to fade. I don't know how I made it back to the trailhead. I don't remember the walk, the drive, or even packing up my gear, but I know one thing for certain. I'll never go back to Red River Gorge. Some places weren't meant to be explored. I bought the trailer last spring, secondhand from a guy who was moving to Florida. It wasn't fancy, but it was enough. That trailer was supposed to be my sanctuary. After the stress of the divorce and losing my job, I needed a break from everything. The thought of spending a few nights by myself, parked somewhere quiet, far from the chaos of my life, sounded like exactly what I needed. So, I headed to a place that had been calling to me ever since I'd heard about it, Lago Lanier. People talked about the lake in hushed tones around the campfire when I was younger. Some said it was cursed. Others claimed that entire towns had been drowned when they flooded the valley to create the lake in the 50s. Cemeteries included. The dead, they said, were still down there, restless under the water. I never paid much attention to the stories. Superstitious nonsense, I thought. But after everything I'd been through lately, the idea of driving to the lake and parking my trailer on a secluded shore was more appealing than ever. A fresh start, even if just for a few days. I found a spot at the edge of a small, isolated cove, far from any of the designated campgrounds or busy boat ramps. Just the quiet lap of water against the shore and the trees standing tall and silent. It was perfect, peaceful, exactly what I was looking for. I parked the trailer and set up camp, watching as the late afternoon sun shimmered on the surface of the lake. That first evening, I cracked open a beer and settled into my lawn chair facing the water. The silence was deep and soothing, almost too quiet. I could barely hear the usual sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves, birds singing, frogs croaking. Just the faintest trickle of the water lapping against the shore. At first, it was comforting. It felt like I was the only person left in the world. But then, as dusk fell, the air started to feel heavy, as if something unseen had slipped into the space around me. I ignored it. Just nerves, I thought. I was stressed, burned out, and needed to relax. But even as the sun slipped below the horizon and the lake turned dark and still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, the first night, I heard the sound. A soft splash, like someone wading through the shallows right outside my trailer. It was nearly midnight, and the fire had long since died out, and I was tucked inside the trailer half dozing when I heard it. Splash. Then, silence. I sat up, heart pounding, listening. Probably a fish, I told myself, or some animal come down for a drink, but it wasn't. The splash came again, and this time it was louder, more deliberate, as if someone was walking through the water. Slowly, I crept to the window and peeked out, my breath catching in my throat. The moon was bright enough to light the water, and for a second I swore I saw a shape, something dark standing in the shallows just a few feet from shore. It wasn't an animal. It was tall, like a person, But the figure was strange. Its head was too low, like it was hunched over, and its limbs looked wrong. I blinked, and the figure was gone. I stood, frozen, heart racing, as I stared out at the still water. Nothing, just the calm surface of the lake, as if nothing had been there at all. I didn't sleep much after that, tossing and turning, convinced it was just my imagination. I'd been through a lot lately. It was bound to mess with my head. The next morning, I tried to shake off the unease. I spent the day fishing, even though I didn't catch much. I kept telling myself I was just tired, that the isolation was getting to me. But then, when I walked back to the trailer in the late afternoon, I noticed something strange. Footprints. Small barefoot prints in the mud, leading from the water's edge up toward my trailer. They were small, like a child's. I stared at them for a long time, trying to convince myself they were my own tracks from earlier. But I hadn't been barefoot, and they didn't look right. They crisscrossed each other, as if someone had wandered back and forth, around and around, before disappearing into the trees. I crouched down, running my fingers over the prints, a chill creeping up my spine. There was no one else out here. No one but me. I looked up at the lake, at the still, murky water. It seemed darker than before, as if the light couldn't quite reach beneath the surface. I told myself it was nothing. A trick of the light. Maybe an animal had left the prints, or maybe someone else had camped here before I arrived. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. That night, the footsteps returned. I had just turned off the lights and settled into bed when I heard it. The soft, wet squelch of footsteps moving slowly around the trailer. My heart began to race. I grabbed the flashlight and the small hunting knife I'd brought with me, inching toward the door. The footsteps stopped just outside. I flicked on the light and threw open the door, shining the beam of the flashlight out into the night. Nothing. Just the trees, the water, and the faint rustle of wind. But I knew I'd heard it. I wasn't imagining things. I'd heard footsteps circling the trailer, bare footsteps like someone creeping through the mud. I locked the door and stayed up for hours, listening, but there was nothing else that night. Just silence. By the next morning, my nerves were shot. I drove into town to grab supplies and shake off the tension. While waiting at a local diner for my food, I overheard some locals talking about the lake, about the old towns that had been submerged when the dam was built, and about the cemeteries that hadn't been fully relocated before the waters rose. "The dead don't rest easy out there," one of the older men said, his voice low. "You spend too much time by the lake at night, and you'll start hearing them. You'll hear them call your name, luring you down to the water." I felt the cold sweat trickle down my back. I didn't believe in ghosts or spirits, never had. But the way the man spoke, as if he'd seen something, felt something, unnerved me. I left the diner and drove back to the lake, more on edge than before. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the dread returned. It was stronger now, more insistent, like something in the air had shifted. I sat by the fire, staring at the lake, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The water, dark and still, seemed to be hiding something beneath its surface. And then I heard it. A voice, faint, almost indistinguishable from the breeze, but there, whispering my name. "Rick." I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I stared out at the water, the fire crackling behind me, and the voice came again, soft and distant. "Rick." It wasn't just the wind. It was real. I stood up, backing away from the shore, my pulse racing. I grabbed the flashlight and shined it toward the water, my hands trembling. That's when I saw them. Figures. Dark, pale shapes, just below the surface of the water. They were small, human-shaped, but their faces were twisted and distorted, like they were drowning but frozen in place. The water around them rippled slightly, as if they were trying to reach for me, but they stayed submerged, watching. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stared at the figures, my mind racing. This couldn't be real. It wasn't possible. I was losing it. I had to be. I turned and bolted back to the trailer, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the knife I had grabbed. The footsteps came again that night, louder, more insistent, and the voice kept calling my name. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I didn't care how irrational it seemed or how crazy the story would sound when I got back home. I wasn't staying another night by that cursed lake. I packed up the trailer and tried to start the truck. Dead. The battery was completely drained, even though I hadn't left anything running overnight. My hands shook as I tried again, but the engine wouldn't even turn over. It was as if the life had been sucked out of the vehicle. I was trapped. Panic surged through me as I tried to think. I could hike back to town, but it would take hours, and the thought of leaving the trailer and whatever safety it offered seemed like a death sentence. The water called to me, louder now, the whispers coming more frequently. They wanted me in the lake. I grabbed a set of tools from the back of the trailer, hoping to get the engine working again. As I worked, I felt eyes on me. I could sense them, the figures, standing just at the water's edge, waiting. The temperature dropped, the air growing thick and cold as I frantically tried to get the battery to respond. Finally, after what felt like hours, the engine roared to life. I didn't waste a second. I jumped into the truck, threw it into gear, and peeled out of the campsite, the trailer jerking behind me. As I drove away, I glanced into the rearview mirror. They were there, standing at the edge of the lake, their pale, distorted faces watching me as I sped off into the night. I never went back to Lake Lanier. I haven't told anyone about what I saw or what happened, but even now, months later, when I lie awake at night in my own bed, far from the lake, I can still hear it, the faint sound of whispers, calling my name. The darkness of the Ouachita National Forest stretched before me like an endless abyss. The trees, as ancient as the land itself, rose tall and imposing, blocking any light that might escape from the stars. This was the kind of place I, Marcelo Nogueira, used to love. Complete isolation, pure, untouched nature. I was there to study the behavior of some rare owl species and take a few nighttime photographs. At least that was the plan. At first, everything was as expected. I'd parked my trailer in a remote part of the forest, far from tourist trails and campgrounds. The silence that surrounded the area was reassuring. I was used to this kind of environment and loved the challenge of being completely alone, immersed in nature. But that night, the silence felt different. Thick, heavy. I finished setting up camp and prepared for a night of observation. The wind blew gently, and the leaves made that soft, soothing sound that always accompanied the beginning of a night in the forest. For some reason, though, I felt a slight sense of unease, as if something was watching me. I ignored it. I knew solitude could play tricks on the mind. I had always been a skeptic. I wasn't the type to fall for superstitions or local legends. I went into the trailer to adjust my equipment. I wanted to set up the cameras and recorders to capture sounds and images of the animals that, with luck, would appear around me. But the first sign that something was wrong came then. My cameras started malfunctioning. The display kept flickering, and the images came out distorted, as if something was interfering with the sensors. I looked at the cameras, confused. They were charged, working perfectly before I left home. I tried again, but the problem persisted. I thought it might be magnetic interference, some kind of atmospheric anomaly that could happen in more remote areas. I decided to step outside and check my phone's GPS, but to my surprise, it had no signal. Okay, I thought. It's not the end of the world. I'm in a remote area. It might just be a matter of finding a higher spot to get a signal. But as the night went on, things really started to get strange. I was outside, adjusting the camera lens when I heard the first sound. A low, guttural noise echoing between the trees. It was hard to tell what it was. Something deep in the forest. It sounded distant, but it was enough to put me on alert. I knew all kinds of wild animal sounds, but this wasn't familiar. I swept the darkness with my flashlight, trying to locate the source of the sound, but all I saw was the faint glow of trees and the light reflecting off the leaves. The wind seemed to have stopped suddenly, leaving the forest completely still. There wasn't even the sound of insects or owls. Absolute silence. I took a deep breath, trying to ignore the growing feeling that something was wrong. I knew that sometimes nature could be like this. Predators could silence the environment, scaring off smaller animals. But even by predator standards, that silence was oppressive. I decided to head back to the trailer and wait until morning. Maybe it was just exhaustion talking, and the darkness made everything scarier than it really was. After all, I'd spent the whole day exploring the place. I lay down on my bunk, trying to relax, but the feeling of being watched clung to me like a shadow I couldn't shake. Then I heard the sounds again. Footsteps. I knew the sound of animal footsteps well, but these were different. Heavy, long, with a deliberate dragging. I got up slowly, my senses on high alert. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the door. Something was moving outside. With my heart racing, I carefully opened the trailer door, and the flashlight illuminated the ground around me. Claw marks. The ground was scratched, as if something large had passed through. I stood still for a moment, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. It could have been a bear or a wolf, but the marks were deep, as if made by something strong enough to tear the bark off a tree with a single swipe. A slight pressure began building in my chest. I wasn't easily scared, but what was happening here was strange. Very strange. The next day, I drove to the nearest town. I needed fuel for the generator, and I also wanted to ask a local if they had seen any signs of bears or wolves in that part of the forest. I walked into a small grocery store and casually mentioned to the owner, an elderly man, about the marks and the strange silence from the night before. He suddenly grew serious. His dark eyes stared at me and he said in a grave voice, "That's not a bear, son. That's the shadow of the Black Forest." Confused, I asked what he meant by that, and with a worried expression he told the story of an ancient entity that wandered the forest on nights with a new moon. They say it feeds on travelers' fear, plays with them until it drags them into the darkness. No one who meets it comes back the same. He spoke of the shadow as something that couldn't be defeated, only avoided. I smiled, a little unnerved, thanked him, and returned to the trailer. Small-town superstitions, I thought. Maybe he just wanted to scare me, or perhaps he was exaggerating local legends. But deep down, something inside me felt uneasy. I decided to stay alert, but still rational. That night, the tension grew. The malfunctions with my equipment continued. The trailer's lights began flickering. The generator kept failing, and then I saw them. Shadows, moving between the trees, fast but impossible to make out clearly. Something was out there. I stood up and walked to the window, flashlight pointed into the darkness. And that's when I saw it for the first time. The shadow. It was a tall, misshapen figure, almost humanoid, but its arms were long and grotesque and its eyes glowed with a pale yellow light. It stood about 30 yards away, motionless between the trees. I felt my blood turn to ice. It was completely still, watching me. The silence returned, heavier than ever. I froze, unable to move for a few seconds. When I blinked, it was gone. My rational mind began to crumble. This couldn't be real. I must have been tired. My mind was probably creating these things. But at the same time, my body knew something dangerous was out there. Something I couldn't explain. The following hours were a blur of frustrated attempts to fix the situation. I tried restarting the trailer, adjusting the systems, but everything failed. The lights flickered and went out. The wind, which had been still earlier, began to blow fiercely. But instead of easing the tension, the wind carried whispers. Distant voices, as if the forest itself were trying to tell me something, but I couldn't understand. The shadow appeared again, this time closer, its eyes watching me from the edge of the flashlight's beam. It was getting closer, slowly, playing with me. Panic rose in my throat. It was surrounding me, feeding off my fear, just as the old man at the store had said. I tried to leave. I started the trailer's engine, but it died almost instantly. I had no choice but to face this thing. I grabbed an improvised torch and stepped outside, my hands trembling. I had no idea what to do, but I knew I had to try something. The shadow moved again, floating between the trees. My eyes couldn't focus on it for long, but I knew it was getting closer. It was as if it was wrapping me in its darkness, draining my sanity bit by bit. Then I remembered. The fear. It fed on fear. I needed to control it. I had to force my mind to work. I took a deep breath, closed my eyes, and tried to calm my breathing. The panic began to fade, slowly but surely. I opened my eyes, and it was there, standing just a few feet away. But something had changed. It stopped. My controlled breathing, my slowing heartbeat, seemed to weaken it. The glow in its yellow eyes dimmed. I didn't know how, but it seemed to be working. With one last desperate attempt, I got back into the trailer and started the engine. It sputtered, choked, but then roared back to life. I hit the gas, the sound of the engine drowning out the whispers and the wind. In the rearview mirror, I saw the shadow slowly fading into the darkness. I left the forest that night without looking back. I didn't know what that thing was or how I had escaped, but I knew one thing. I would never return to that forest. The shadow of the Black Forest was real, and I was glad to still be alive to tell the tale.